The Battle of North Bridge, the first spark of independence. Part 1. The long background to the rebellion and the timeline of the preparations. Introduction. The birth of a nation. April 19th, 1775, is not just a date. It is the moment of the fall of an empire and the birth of a modern democratic state. The shots that rang out at North Bridge in the small town of Concord, Massachusetts, echoed not just across the Atlantic, but around the world. This history is not the story of a sudden riot, but an epic of a decade of accumulated anger, philosophical debate, and the ultimate desire for freedom. Chapter 1. The Seeds of Unrest, 1763 to 1770. To understand the background to the war, we must go back at least 12 years. When the 7 Years' War ended in 1763, Britain was the undisputed ruler of the world. But the price of this victory was high. The British treasury was in debt. 1. Politics of taxation. The British Parliament decided that since this war was fought to protect the American colonies, the Americans would have to pay for it. One after another, taxes were imposed. Sugar Act, 1764. Tax on sugar. Stamp Act, 1765. Stamp tax on all legal documents, newspapers, and even playing cards. This created great anger among the Americans. Their main slogan became, "No taxation without representation." 2. Boston Massacre, 1770. March 5, 1770. Tensions reached a peak in the streets of Boston. Soldiers opened fire on British soldiers accused of throwing snow and stones at them, and 5 Americans were killed. This incident created a lasting hatred of the British in the minds of Americans. John Adams and Samuel Adams used this incident as a propaganda tool. Chapter 2. Boston Tea Party and the Intolerable Acts. On the night of December 16, 1773, a group of rebels, Sons of Liberty, threw 342 chests of tea into the sea from a British ship anchored in Boston Harbor. This is the famous Boston Tea Party in history. The British King George III was furious at this incident. In retaliation, he passed the Intolerable Acts in 1774. The port of Boston was completely closed. Massachusetts was stripped of its autonomy, and martial law was imposed there. General Thomas Gage was appointed governor of Massachusetts. These laws created unity among the colonies. They understood that what was happening in Massachusetts today could also happen in Virginia or Pennsylvania tomorrow. Chapter 3. The Powder Alarm and Military Preparations, 1774 to 1775. In September 1774, General Gage secretly seized a Charlestown ammunition depot. When news of this spread, thousands of armed American militia began marching toward Boston. Although there was no battle that day, it taught a great lesson. 1. The British realized that the Americans were ready to fight. 2. The Americans realized that they needed a strong network for rapid news communication. The birth of the Minutemen. The rebels formed their own secret army. They were mainly farmers, teachers, or ordinary businessmen. They were trained to go into battle in their home clothes, hence Minutemen. They began to secretly stockpile ammunition behind the walls of houses, under haystacks, or under churches. Chapter 4. Concord, the rebels' armory. The city of Concord was about 20 miles west of Boston. In early 1775, it became the rebels' main armory. British intelligence received information that a large amount of cannonballs, gunpowder, and food was stored there. It was also reported that the rebel leaders Samuel Adams and John Hancock were hiding in the city of Lexington. General Gage came up with a plan He thought that if these weapons could be destroyed quickly and the leaders arrested, it would be possible to suppress the rebellion without bloodshed. He gave his most capable officer, Colonel Francis Smith, command of a special force of about 700 soldiers. Chapter 5: The Intelligence Network and the Old North Church. While the British were preparing for this secret operation, American intelligence was also not sitting idly by. Dr. Joseph Warren was the head of this intelligence network. He received information that the British would cross the river and head for Concord. He sent Paul Revere and William Doss on 2 separate expeditions on the night of April 18th. The lantern signal. A man named Robert Newman lit 2 lanterns on the top of the Old North Church. This meant, "British are coming by sea." Paul Revere began his famous midnight ride. Knocking on every house along the way, he shouted, "The regulars are coming out!" His warning ensured that when the British reached Concord, they would find no arsenal there, but a group of patriots ready with guns. Part 2: The Midnight Rider and the Bloodbath at Lexington. Chapter 6: Paul Revere's Journey and Capture. April 18th, 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. When 2 lanterns lit up on the top of the Old North Church, Paul Revere was waiting on the banks of the Charles River. He knew that the British were crossing the river by boat. This was a faster route than by land. Revere began to gallop along the dark country roads with his horse. 1. Type of warning signal. Many people think that Revere spread the news alone. In fact, it was an organized network. Wherever Revere stopped, he would inform members of the local safety committee, who would then ride in the other direction. Thus, within a few hours, dozens of villages throughout Massachusetts were on alert for war. 2. Samuel Prescott's arrival. Upon reaching Lexington, Revere warned John Hancock and Samuel Adams. There he met Dr. Samuel Prescott. Prescott was a local doctor. He decided to help Revere lead the way to Concord. Unfortunately, they encountered British patrols along the way. Although Revere was captured, Prescott bravely jumped off his horse and escaped through the woods, eventually reaching Concord. This was a turning point in the history of the war, for without Prescott's arrival, Concord would not have been ready for battle. Chapter 7: Lexington Green, Breaking the Dawn Silence. April 19th, 4:30 a.m. to 5:30 a.m. The town of Lexington was shrouded in the early morning fog. The British troops were marching quickly on foot. 77 militiamen were assembled on the small field called Lexington Green. They were led by Captain John Parker. Parker was a veteran soldier, and despite his weakened body from tuberculosis, he stood his ground that day. 1. Parker's historical instructions. Parker knew that his soldiers were mere children to the British regulars. He ordered, "Stand firm in your position. You will not fire until the British fire first. But if they want to fight, let it begin here." 2. The Shot of Mystery. British Major Pitcairn entered the field with his soldiers and shouted to the rebels to lay down their arms. Just as the rebels were scattering and retreating, a shot was heard. The British claimed that the shot was fired by the rebels from behind the jungle or walls. The Americans claimed that the British soldiers fired in excitement. To this day, historians are not sure who fired the first shot, but that one shot turned the whole situation into hell in an instant. 3. Unequal fighting. Without orders, the British soldiers opened fire and charged with bayonets. Within minutes, 8 Americans were killed and 10 wounded on Lexington Green. Only 1 British soldier was slightly wounded. The British continued to march towards Concord, celebrating and beating drums. They thought the rebellion had been crushed, but they did not know that the real battle awaited them. Chapter 8. Preparations for Concord, 5:30 a.m. to 7 a.m. The sound of the Lexington shots echoed through Concord. After Dr. Prescott's warning, the Concord militia chief, Colonel James Barrett, quickly gathered his troops. 1. Hiding weapons. Barrett knew the British were coming for weapons. He hid cannonballs and ammunition under the plowed soil on his own farm. Even many weapons were thrown into the woods and wells. When the British entered the town, they found nothing of note. 2. Militia. Gathering, hundreds of armed farmers from the towns around Concord, Acton, Bedford, and Lincoln gathered on the hills. They watched from a distance as the British entered their town. They numbered about 450 and were growing by the minute. Chapter 9. The capture of Concord and British miscalculations, 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. Colonel Smith and his 700 British soldiers entered Concord at about 7 a.m. They cordoned off the entire town, South Bridge and North Bridge. Colonel Smith strategically sent troops to capture 2 bridges. Captain Walter Lowry was sent with about 100 troops to guard the North Bridge. Search of the town. The British went from house to house searching for weapons. They found large wooden cannon wheels and some food. They set fire to the wooden wheels. Smoke, illusion. When smoke began to rise from the center of the town, the American militia standing on the hill panicked. They thought the British were burning the entire town. This smoke was the final trigger for the battle. A militiaman named Joseph Hosmer shouted, "Will you let them burn the town down?" This question acted like gunpowder among the militia. They decided that they would no longer be on the defensive, but would now march to the bridge and directly confront the British. Chapter 10. March to the North Bridge. The Acton militia, led by Captain Isaac Davis, came forward. They were the most disciplined. The drummers began to beat the battle rhythm. The Americans began to descend the hill and advance towards the North Bridge. When British Captain Lowry saw hundreds of armed men approaching them in an orderly manner, he panicked and retreated to the other side of the bridge. Part 3. The Roar of the North Bridge and the British Escape. Chapter 11. The 2 sides face off at the bridge, 9:30 a.m. The North Bridge of Concord was a simple wooden structure, but at 9:30 a.m. on April 19, 1775, it became the most important battlefield in the world. British Captain Walter Lowry's approximately 100 grenadiers and infantry were positioned on the east bank of the bridge. Approximately 400 to 500 American militia were approaching from the west. 1. British defense strategy. When Captain Lowry saw a large rebel force coming down the hill, he became somewhat alarmed. He ordered his troops to cross the bridge to the east bank and take up positions there in a special format called street firing. This was a strategy where one line would shoot back and the next line would come forward. But this strategy was difficult to implement in this narrow space on the bridge. 2. The heroism of Isaac Davis. Leading the Americans from the front was Captain Isaac Davis of Acton. He was a gunsmith and a very religious man. Before the battle, he had told his wife, "Take care of my children." When asked if his men were afraid to face the British, he said, "I haven't a man that is afraid to go. There is not a single man in my men who is afraid to go." Chapter 12. The shot heard round the world, 10 a.m. When the Americans reached the very edge of the bridge, they still did not fire a single shot. Colonel Barrett had strict orders. No one was to pull the trigger until the British fired first. 1. The first volley. the British panicked and began to fire. After a few isolated shots at first, they fired a volley. Captain Isaac Davis and a young man named Abner Hosmer were killed instantly. These two were the first military martyrs for American independence. 2. John Buttrick's historic shout. When Davis was seen falling to the ground through the smoke, the Americans' patience was over. Major John Buttrick, a militia officer from Concord, raised his gun and shouted into the air, "Fire, fellow soldiers! For God's sake, fire!" This was the first time in history that an American officer ordered his soldiers to open fire directly on British regulars. In an instant, a hail of bullets came from the Americans. 3 British soldiers were killed on the spot, and 9 officers and men were wounded. 3. The British were stunned. The British soldiers could not imagine that these simple farmers would fire back at them and injure their officers. Breaking the chains, the British soldiers began to run towards the center of the city of Concord. This was the first major blow to the pride of the British Empire. Chapter 13. The Midday Silence and the British Hesitation, 11 a.m. to 12:30 p.m. When the British returned to the center of the city after being defeated at the bridge, Colonel Francis Smith was somewhat confused. He still had enough troops, but he could sense that the situation around him was changing. Ammo and weapons. The British did not find any large stockpiles of weapons. What they did find was burned by then. Treatment of the wounded. The British were caring for their wounded soldiers with the help of local doctors. They even secured some horse-drawn carriages to carry the wounded. The rebels gathering. The British looked through binoculars to see that the surrounding hills were no longer empty. Hundreds, if not thousands of militia were now surrounding the city. They realized that there was no chance of winning now, but rather the greater challenge was to return with their lives. Chapter 14. Battle Road, the Long Road of Death, 1 p.m. Finally, around 1 p.m., Colonel Smith ordered the retreat back to Boston. The 20-mile road from Concord to Boston became known in history as the Battle Road. 1. The beginning of guerrilla warfare. While the British were marching back in order, the Americans were no longer fighting conventional battles. They began sneaking through the stone walls, large trees, forests, and farmhouse windows on both sides of the road. The red uniforms of the British were becoming easy targets against the green of the forest. 2. Merriam's Corner. At Merriam's Corner, a mile from Concord, the British were crossing a small bridge when hundreds of American militia attacked. There was no single leader. Each farmer fought as his own commander. The British troops were in utter disarray. They realized that this was no longer a riot, but a full-scale war. Chapter 15. The British's extreme suffering. The British troops were exhausted. They had been marching for nearly 20 hours without food or sleep. The constant firing of the Americans added to their nervous tension. Many British soldiers threw down their guns in fear and ran for their lives. Colonel Smith himself was shot in the leg. The situation was such that if help had not arrived, all 700 British soldiers would have surrendered that day. Part 4. The Corridor of Death and the Bloody Ganges of Mammotomy. Chapter 16. Escape to Lexington, 2 p.m. The road from Concord to Lexington was no longer a road, it was a death trap for the British. The American militia were no longer just men from Concord or Lexington. Thousands from all over Massachusetts had gathered on this road. 1. Guerrilla tactics. The British regulars were used to fighting face-to-face in the open, but the Americans were fighting Indian style. They were shooting from behind walls and running to another place. The British soldiers had no idea where the bullets were coming from. When they fired into a bush, They could not find anyone. 2. Ammunition shortage. The British soldiers had almost used up the 36 rounds of ammunition they had with them. Their gun barrels were getting hot and useless. Officers noticed that the soldiers were starting to throw away their heavy backpacks and guns in exhaustion. Colonel Smith's army was so disorganized that they were considering surrendering before they reached Lexington. Chapter 17. Lord Percy's Rescue, 2:30 p.m. Just as Colonel Smith's troops were nearing Lexington and were about to collapse, they heard the sound of musical instruments in the distance. General Gage had received word from Boston that the situation might worsen, so he sent Lord Percy with 1,000 new troops that morning. 1. Percy as a savior. Percy not only brought fresh troops, he also brought 2 large 6-pounder cannons. Arriving near Lexington Green, he began firing. The sound of the cannon fire forced the American militia to temporarily retreat. This was a new lease of life for the British. 2. Condition of the soldiers. When Smith's troops reached the safety of Percy's line of soldiers, they lay down on the grass. Many of the soldiers were panting like dogs from exhaustion. They had marched about 20 miles and fought for 3 hours. Chapter 18. The Horror of Monotony, 4 p.m. After a short rest, Lord Percy realized that they had to reach Boston before dark. He arranged his troops in a large square or square formation so that there was security all around. But after reaching the village of Monotony, now Arlington, the most brutal part of the battle began. 1. Civil war and hand-to-hand fighting. The fighting at Monotony was no longer confined to the bushes. It became a civil war. The Americans were shooting at the British from behind windows. The enraged British soldiers then entered the houses. They broke down the doors and began to kill civilians with bayonets. The furniture in the houses was destroyed, and many houses were set on fire. 2. Jason Russell's sacrifice. A farmer named Jason Russell, 58, was fighting in front of his own house. He said, "A man's home is his castle." The British soldiers entered his house and brutally killed him, and 11 other militiamen with him. The house still stands today, and its walls bear the marks of the bullets of April 19th. Chapter 19. Samuel Whittemore, the 80-year-old hero. The most incredible character in the Battle of Monotony was Samuel Whittemore. He was an 80-year-old old man and a former British soldier. When he saw the British passing through his village, he took his own gun, 2 pistols, and a sword, and hid behind a stone wall. He single-handedly killed 3 British soldiers. Then a group of British soldiers surrounded him. He was shot in the head and bayoneted 13 times. The British left him for dead, but miraculously he survived and lived to the age of 98. He became a symbol of American indomitable courage. Chapter 20. Safe haven in Charlestown, 7 p.m. The sun was setting. The British were exhausted. They were approaching Charlestown. They knew that if they could climb the hill in Charlestown, they would be under the protection of the cannons of the British warship HMS Somerset in Boston Harbor. 1. Last-minute pursuit. The Americans pursued the British until the very last moment. General Heath and Dr. Joseph Warren were on horseback commanding the militia. But the British stopped the Americans with cannon fire in the narrow streets of Charlestown. 2. Night scene. By 7 p.m., the British had crossed the neck of Charlestown and reached a fortified position. The long battle of April 19th ended. Chapter 21. Results and casualties. The losses on both sides after this one-day battle were irreparable. British, 73 killed, 174 wounded. and 26 missing, about 20% of the total force casualties. American, 49 killed, 39 wounded, and 5 missing. But the psychological impact was greater than the numbers. The British realized that they were not fighting a rioter, but an armed and determined nation. That night, 15,000 American militia surrounded the city of Boston on all sides. The siege of Boston began. Part 5. The Awakening of a Continent and the Changing Geopolitics. Chapter 22. The morning of April 20th. Boston under siege. When the sun set on April 19th, the British were safely encamped, but they were literally prisoners. On the morning of April the 20th, General Gage awoke to find the city of Boston surrounded on all sides. 1. A wall of 20,000 men. Throughout the night, militia had marched on foot and on horseback from every corner of Massachusetts, as well as from Connecticut, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. By morning, some 20,000 armed Americans had blocked Boston's only land route, Boston Neck. 2. Supply cutoff. The British troops and loyalists inside the city were cut off from food supplies. The British Navy was now the only hope for bringing supplies by sea. The victory of April 19th gave Americans the confidence that they could not only fight, but also hold off an imperial army. Chapter 23. The speed of news and the propaganda war. A bigger battle than the war itself was fought over information. Who fired first? Did the British oppress the common people? The entire American public opinion depended on the answer to this question.
1. Depositions. The Massachusetts Provincial Congress became active soon after the war. They recorded the statements of hundreds of eyewitnesses. These affidavits emphasized that the British had fired on innocent farmers at Lexington Green without any provocation. 2. The race to London. The Americans did a very clever thing. They sent a fast ship, the Quero, to London under the command of a captain named Richard Darby. Their goal was to get the American message to the British people before General Gage's official report reached London. Result: the American ship arrived in London 12 days before Gage's report. When Londoners read in the newspapers that their royal troops were killing their own citizens, the streets of London were in uproar. Anti-British public opinion began to form in Britain itself. Chapter 24. Philadelphia and the Second Continental Congress, May 1775. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Until the events of April 19th, most delegates had wanted to compromise with Britain in some way, but the bloodshed of Lexington and Concord changed everything. 1. John Adams and the call for independence. Representative John Adams of Boston argued that it was no longer just Massachusetts that was fighting, but all of America had to unite. He proposed that the militia around Boston be recognized as the Continental Army. 2. A unified army. Congress realized that it was not possible to win a long-term war with isolated militias. They decided to create a central command. But who would lead this army? Chapter 25. George Washington's inauguration, June 1775. This was one of the most important decisions in American history. John Adams proposed Virginia Representative George Washington as Commander-in-Chief. Why was Washington chosen? Military experience. He fought for the British in the French and Indian War. Political unity. Washington was a Southerner, Virginia. Making him a leader would unite the Southern and Northern colonies. Personality. Washington was very tall, serious, and unselfish. He refused to accept any salary for this duty. When Washington rode to Boston on horseback, The rebellion of April 19th turned into a revolution or full-scale war. Chapter 26. Impact on world politics, France and Spain. The sound of the gunfire of April 19th reached not only London but also Paris and Madrid. 1. France's opportunity. King Louis XVI of France and his ministers had long been looking for an opportunity to humiliate the British. Seeing the American victory at the Battle of North Bridge, they realized that the Americans had potential. They began to plan to help the Americans by secretly sending weapons and money. 2. The first model of modern democracy. European philosophers were surprised to see a group of peasants challenging the best professional army in the modern world. This shook the foundations of the monarchy in Europe and also served as an indirect inspiration for the French Revolution that took place a few years later. Chapter 27. Thomas Paine and Common Sense. Thomas Paine put the tension of war into words. In early 1776, he published his famous pamphlet, Common Sense. He argued that how could a small island, Britain, rule a vast continent, America? Paine repeatedly recalled the bloodshed of April 19th in his writings. He said that the blood shed on Lexington Green had severed the last thread of the relationship with Britain. His writings awakened a strong desire for freedom in the minds of ordinary people. Chapter 28. The Legacy of April 19th. In modern America, April 19th is not just a battle date, it is the foundation of their national identity. Patriots' Day. This day is celebrated as a public holiday in Massachusetts. Poetic immortality. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote about this battle, the shot heard round the world. This one sentence has sustained the significance of the entire battle for centuries. The Battle of North Bridge proved that the determination of ordinary people for truth and freedom is more powerful than any modern lethal weapon. Sixth installment, The Untouchables of the Revolution and the Hard Days of the Siege. Chapter 29, Behind the Scenes. The contribution of revolutionary women, the home front. When the drums and the warning bells rang out on the morning of April 19th, 1775, it wasn't just men who prepared for war. Women were also prepared for that day. They knew that it was their responsibility to protect their homes and villages if their husbands or sons went to war. 1. Mary Hartwell. After receiving Paul Revere's warning, this brave woman from Lincoln ran in the dark with her baby in her arms to tell her neighbors. Because of her bravery, the Lincoln militia was able to reach Concord in time. Chapter 34. Modern Assessment of April 19th. Today's historians believe that the Battle of North Bridge was the first asymmetric warfare in world history. It proved that ideology and the determination to defend the motherland were much more powerful than technology or numbers of soldiers. Chapter 35. The minute-by-minute timeline of April 19th. To understand the chaos of the entire war, it is essential to know its chronological order. This timeline will serve as a guide in this vast history of 20,000 words. April 18th, 10 p.m. British troops begin crossing the river by boat from Boston Common. April 18th, 10:30 p.m. Paul Revere and William Doss leave Boston. 2 lanterns are lit in the Old North Church. Chapter 36. The final fate of the war's greatest heroes. Where did history take those whose lives were forever changed by the Battle of North Bridge? 1. General Thomas Gage. He was recalled to England for his failure in the war. He never set foot on American soil again, and his military career ended there. Chapter 37. Why did the British lose that day? Military analysis. Why did the best army in the world at the time surrender to a group of farmers? There were some specific reasons behind this: arrogance and underestimation. The British thought that the Americans were nothing more than an untrained mob. They underestimated the courage of the rebels. Chapter 38: Modern Concord and Minuteman National Park. Today, if anyone wants to see the historic battlefield, they should go to Minuteman National Historical Park in Massachusetts. North Bridge, reconstructed. The original wooden bridge no longer exists, but a bridge of the same design has been built in its place. Chapter 39. Conclusion of a 20,000-word history. That day, on April 19th, 1775, proved that no empire can last forever if its subjects are baptized into the mantra of freedom. Those shots from the North Bridge not only created the American Constitution, but they also sowed the seeds of the end of colonialism around the world. The history of the North Bridge is not a dusty old story. It is a living spirit that still keeps the torch of freedom burning in the hearts of every human being today. History is not just the triumph of kings and kings. History is the epic of the extraordinary courage of our common people. Through this channel, I try to present the stories of those lost heroes to you so that the dusty pages of history can speak again. If today's story has touched your heart, if you think we should all know about the sacrifices of these heroes, then please share this video and subscribe to the channel to accompany us on this historical journey. Your subscription will inspire me to go deeper and find the stories of our roots. Remember, a nation that forgets its history will never have a bright future. Be well and stay with history. Thank you.